Welcome to the Keys podcast, Trust Matters Lessons in Leadership with me, Ellie Potter. In this series, I'll be speaking to multi-academy trust leaders, sector experts, leadership coaches, and more to hear about their journeys in leadership. You'll gain practical tips and advice and get their insights on some of the biggest topics impacting the education sector right now. In this week's episode, we welcome Katie Oliver, Managing Director at Ark Start. I'll be asking Katie about why Ark has a particular focus on early years education, how the trust developed Ark Start, and why Ark Start is doing early years differently to the traditional model. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to leave us a review or like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Well, firstly, welcome, Katie. Thank you very much for coming on today. I think what would be helpful for the listeners is if you can tell us a bit about where your journey's led you to become Managing Director of Ark Start.
Sure. Hi, thanks for having me. So I have, a slightly unusual background for doing the role I do, in that I am not a teacher and I'm not an early years specialist, and I wouldn't claim to be either. I first got involved in the education sector because in 2006 I was working for a local MP in North Westminster and met Lucy Heller, the CEO of Ark, and ended up joining on a 3-month contract to support her with what at the time was called research and policy. And that was 6 months before we opened our first school, Burlington Danes Academy in White City. And I didn't do any research or policy work. I got stuck into opening Burlington Danes. And then since then have been at Ark forever. I was the projects director, so responsible for growing the Ark network. So very proudly have opened our 39 schools, and then became the operations director, so responsible for all the services that went into the schools, working alongside the education team. And then decided, when was it? I guess 2019, I think, we decided that we should start again, and that the next piece of work that we should really do would be Ark Start. So looking at our very youngest children and how we could build a sort of younger sister to our schools network in the form of a group of nurseries that did, the work of closing the achievement gap that opens before children even reach school.
And in 2019, what was that moment, the pivot? Why early years?
We had been thinking about it for ages and ages. And, our schools, like so many schools, experience children coming in, not having access to services they needed to, families kind of trying to work out how to navigate the system, children not ready to thrive. And so our schools, like lots of other schools, were experiencing those issues firsthand. At the same time, there'd been the change of the way that the entitlements were structured, and so what we were seeing was sort of changes within the sort of early years market that actually weren't really in the best interests of our families. So schools struggling to meet the 30-hour entitlement for working families, disadvantaged children being pushed out of the system in other places. And so we started thinking about, well, how can we make our nurseries really work? And we were thinking about it, and everyone kept saying, you can't do nurseries. Like, they're not sustainable. The workforce, there's a recruitment crisis. It's too hard, it's not really it's too hard. You can't do it. And eventually we sort of said, well, I mean, we're so privileged with the support of our donors. We have this huge trust that has all this resource and capacity. Feels like we have to do this. Otherwise we're kind of saying, it can't be done. Like, we have to be able to do this. So that was sort of the pivot, I suppose. And it was, I guess, with the support of our board, who were like, yeah, okay, let's try this. And of course, then we almost immediately entered the pandemic. And there was a huge moment of saying, well, hang on, do we
carry on?
Do we go, or do we stop? And if we stop, does that mean we stop forever? And again, our board, but also the kind of our other supporters were like, nope, let's just go ahead. So we opened our first nursery in the middle of the pandemic, which was quite unorthodox, but was actually really great. And now we are 4 nurseries. We've got a 5th one opening next week, and we're hoping to get to kind of 8 to 12 in the next year or so. We have almost four of the three of the nurseries at the moment are on Ark School sites, so co-hosted on Ark School sites. But one of them is working in partnership with a maintained school in Kensington, and we're in discussion with a whole range of other potential partners across, outside of the Ark network.
And how would you describe Ark Start and like how it's different from a traditional nurseries model?
So Ark Start, we describe it as a trust-governed but independently managed PVI. So a PVI nursery is part of the private and voluntary sector, so not a state function. And by trust governed, what we mean is that, Ark is at its core, it's about aligned mission and values to our kind of education charity and to our schools network. Our director of education is the chair of our program board, so that keeps that connection between the schools network and the nursery network. And so I suppose I guess we think about it as kind of trying to be the best of both. So the best of the schools system in terms of we're teacher-led, we're very informed by the curriculum and pedagogy, not just of early years, but also understanding how that trajectory looks into primary school. We're very, very attached to the idea that the early years workforce should get the same sort of access to professional development and training that we now have come to expect of the school system. So all of those sort of really great things about a school and why a school nursery is a great thing, with the flexibility of a private nursery and the idea that actually we have to recognise that nursery is not just about the early education of children, it's also about families' childcare requirements and the sort of flexibility that is inevitable with very young children. So, all year round, longer days, all of that sort of more traditional nursery type operational model, and bringing those two things together.
And how do you balance it being affordable, but also high quality if you're trying to do both, have that schools model as well as having that private model like intertwined together?
Yeah. So I guess there's lots of different ways of answering that. And I suppose the first thing to say is that, there is very little money in the early years system. And what that means is that staff are really underpaid. And it would be kind of remiss of me not to comment on the fact that, we should think as a society and as a country about why we pay some of our most important, generally women, who are doing some of the most important work, and why we don't pay them on a par with other roles. So I suppose there's a sort of piece there about there just isn't enough money to pay people what the work is worth.
Yeah.
But in terms of the sort of fundamental kind of economics of our network, we are so we're obviously really, really privileged to have the generosity of our donors, which is supporting us with the scaling and the growth of our nursery network. Our individual nurseries do operate within the government funding structures, so they are sort of sustainable in themselves. And the way we make that work is, I suppose, we're working from school sites, so we're not paying kind of commercial rentals on a sort of central London site. We pay the schools for the space and for, cleaning and maintenance, things like that, but we're not paying kind of mega rents. We are not for profit. So any potential surplus gets invested back into the nursery. We make really, good use of the scale that Ark has as an organisation for some of the back office support functions, so HR, finance, that sort of thing. So there are obviously operational efficiencies in that. And I suppose the most important thing is about making sure that you've got really, really high quality provision that really works for families, which means that you're full all the time. And so thinking about how we make sure that we're operating at that kind of 90% occupancy the whole year round. We've got a very considered staff structure that means that we've got more staff between the time of 9 till 3, term time only, and we have less staff who operate either in the morning or the afternoons and then through the holidays, so that we can account for that. The sort of different demands that families have. And I think that's a really, that kind of connection between how you staff the time and making sure the ratios are right with what families need is a really sensitive thing. But if you get it right, you can make it work.
Works, yeah. And you mentioned about the recruitment crisis. Obviously in early years, that is quite, it's even bigger of an issue than it is throughout the rest of the sector. You'd mentioned before we started the conversation that Bridget Phillipson had actually visited one of your nurseries, which is super exciting. Looking now at a new government, and obviously I'm sure we're going to see more and more changes and policies come out over the next few months and obviously year. What would you like to see from them? And what do you think are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to early years and really getting that funding and recruitment and pedagogy and all of that right?
So I guess I think there's two different things that that I would like to see the new government look at. And I suppose there's something about workforce and then something about sort of structure. From a workforce perspective, it's like unquestionably like the recruitment and retention crisis is acute. And it's really interesting to think about why that is. And people obviously always just, talk about the remuneration, which is obviously true. We need to pay roles better. But I think there's also something much, much more fundamental, which is about people feeling like it's not a high value role. And actually, when you talk to our team or other people, they say, they love working with young children, right? They want to work with young children. It's a vocation. But they feel, that it's sort of low status. It's not recognised as being important work. The workforce as a whole has felt, feels sort of undervalued and not just under remunerated. And I think one of the examples of that was during the pandemic when, policy decisions or rules and protocols that were being sent out to schools, nurseries were just being forgotten in how that was supposed to work. And of course, you've got a whole, young children are ill a lot. We know that young children were asymptomatic or largely asymptomatic when it came to COVID. I think there was a sense within the workforce that they were being asked to do really quite, high risk
stakes,
frontline work without being given any of the, things like we had a nursery that opened, we didn't get gloves and PPE until much later than the school. We were, there was that sense that nursery had sort of been forgotten. An afterthought. And I think given that, nurseries being open for families was such a significant thing for people to be able to work, particularly our sort of nurses and doctors, but also other key workers, I think the nursery staff workforce as a whole often felt like they'd been really overlooked. And it sort of, I suppose, confirmed that it was not for some people, it confirmed the sense that they just weren't
valued as highly,
not valued. So I think that's a good example. In terms of our experience of opening during COVID, it was really interesting. So we opened the first setting in October, the second one in the following March. We stayed open the whole way through. I think we called them the second and third lockdowns. And we had to work incredibly hard, both to interpret the kind of rules and regulations and make sure that we were keeping our team safe, or as safe as possible and minimizing risk. But also making sure that we were kind of building this thing. What was fascinating is that almost immediately we had families like desperate to send their children to nursery, and we filled really quickly. And for lots of those families, it was the only interaction they were having with an institution, and in-face interactions around their children. And so it was actually a really lovely, it sounds really weird, but it was a really lovely starting point, because it was a starting point that suddenly felt very much like we were all working.
People wanted you and they needed you.
Needed you, felt really grateful that it was there. We were working in really close partnership. Families were incredibly supportive of, changes to the protocols around food or around kind of changing. People were incredibly supportive when staff were off sick. And, it felt like a really sort of slightly counterintuitively, it felt like a really important way of building real trust within the two communities that we opened in, because of the sense that we were
doing it together, I guess.
Doing it together.
And one of the lasting impacts of the pandemic that we're beginning to see is the socialization of children who were born in those years of the pandemic. And obviously you're starting to see those in your nurseries now and going into reception year one. How are you experiencing that, and how are the staff saying that it's different, like these cohorts of children are different to the ones that came 5-10 years ago?
Well, we weren't running nurseries 5-10 years ago, so I think across the sector so in reception this year we've got what with the COVID babies. I think it's clear that we're seeing really that there's all these sorts of we're seeing all these gaps that children haven't experienced. I think probably the most obvious one for us is the number of families that we've seen over the last few years who haven't had access to other services and therefore haven't been clear about emerging additional needs, special needs, haven't been able to get access to the support they need. Children who, for the first time might be 3 years old, who've, for the first time they've come into contact with an education or a health professional, and therefore the journey that a family needs to go on to recognise that, that they haven't maybe had the support they needed, or, that they need additional help. I think that's been huge. And I think that schools are still really dealing with the kind of fallout of all of that. I think it's interesting because I think in some environments, the pandemic has created that real partnership with families, but obviously in other places it's really broken trust, and we're seeing all the issues around attendance and all of that kind of the breaking of the social contract. So I think there's lots of different ways that it's playing out, and I'm not sure that we've seen the end of it. My children are in year 8 and year 5, and you see very different versions of how the lockdown affected children at the different stages that they were at. So I think we've probably got quite a lot more of this to play out. But yeah, from our perspective, I think it's about making, our nurseries definitely felt like they were often the very first place that a family had kind of got to.
And something you touched on there that is really important in early years is identifying those potential special educational needs. How do you make sure that in your nurseries those sort of things are being spotted early on and the support and the provision is there? Because as we know, as things go on and time goes on, it can be harder and harder to support a child who hasn't had that early support.
So we work really closely. So part of our training and development with our team is them really understanding child development and really understanding age-related developmental milestones and really thinking about each individual child and sort of recognizing if there are gaps or things that they should identify. Our head teacher, we call her, is also our inclusion lead and works really, really closely to try to work with individual members of the team about particular children if there are concerns, and to work with their families. And then we work really closely with the inclusion lead in a host school to support from that perspective. And then, of course, with the local authority. It looks really different in different places because local authority services are different, thresholds are different, families respond differently. But I think it's all about being able to work, in a very bespoke way with an individual child and an individual family to make sure that the child is getting what they need. I think it's a huge issue in nurseries and for schools that, nurseries aren't given funding for children with special needs, and they achieve, that funding comes later, if at all. Schools are spending time going through the process. It isn't working, particularly for those very young children, and I think it needs an overhaul.
And when it comes to transition from nursery into year R, what are some of those key things that you think need to be focused on to make sure that's as smooth as possible?
So I think it's about understanding the expectations of reception and helping children make sure that they're in a place where they can manage that transition, right? So working with the school, even just knowing where you put your coat or knowing, what the classroom looks like, meeting the teacher, the parents feeling confident in that transition. So I think there's lots and lots of really small kind of practical things that we do that just really, really helps that. There are things like attendance, where obviously attendance isn't statutory in nursery. And we would obviously, expect as a sort of childcare provider that parents can take their children out of nursery whenever they like and go on holiday in term time, and they can do all of those things. And so I think in that sort of 6 months, 9 months before they go to school, it's about starting to talk to parents about the fact that of course that's fine, but when you go to school,
things change.
That things will change, and this is how that's and so I think it's about understanding what that journey looks like and helping parents understand what that journey looks like, and working with the school to make sure it's as smooth as possible. And with silly things like how you have lunch, the expectations that a child picks up their own plate and takes it to put on the tray to take it away, or, you know, all of those kind of small things that build to
bigger things
to
down
build
the
to
line.
bigger things, exactly, so that transition feels super smooth. And it's really, you know, it's really lovely to have to see all of that work. So we often have, during the summer term, there'll be lots of opportunities for the nursery children to go over to the reception class and kind of see how
Look
it
around.
is, look around. Yeah, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so nice to go to a nursery on a school site.
Yeah.
You know,
the familiarity's there as well, isn't it?
I don't think that our children feel like that's the big.
Yeah.
I don't think they feel like it's a big transition. You know, and people talk a lot about how actually sometimes the bigger transition is reception to year one.
Yeah.
So I think it's incredibly important, and I think if you get it right, you really, you know, it's
the benefits are massive. Yeah.
Huge.
And one of the things you touched on there as well is engaging with parents. We actually have a group, a Facebook group of 40,000 primary school leaders. And one of the biggest topics they've spoken about in the last year, it's just become a bigger and bigger issue, is engaging with parents and seeing more and more pushback and disillusionment between the parents and the school.
Yeah.
How do you think setting those foundations in place in nursery helps the transition into school for the parents more so than just the children, and kind of having those boundaries and expectations at an earlier time?
Yeah, I think, you know, as a parent of when I had very young children, and I think parents of very young children are really, really want to get help and support and really want to understand how they can best help their children. And so I think it's a kind of unique moment in a family's development of being broadly, relatively open to being like, oh, okay, how do I do toilet training? How can I help them with their, you know, stop using a dummy? How can I help my child? I really want to help them. And so I think you can build real alignment and trust at a really early stage that is really clearly about the child, which of course is what every educationist would want to do the whole way through, but I think just becomes more and more challenging as different kind of dynamics feed in, I suppose. So I think there is a unique opportunity to build a really trusting relationship at that stage where, you know, parents can come, you know, there's just more flexibility about how you engage with parents and them coming into setting and all of those things that in the school system, however open and warm a school is, there is a kind of
a separation.
So I do think if you get that right at that stage and build that trust and that confidence, that can be, in the same way as it is for a child, it is a really good foundation to move into primary school and to feel that confidence going on. We've done quite a lot of work at one of our nurseries with Citizens UK on kind of using community organising methodologies to support parents to work together and think about how they want the school to, what kind of space they want the school and the nursery to be for them. How do they feel comfortable building those relationships? And it's been really
That's
interesting.
really interesting. What are the sort of, how much do you get involved in that then? Do you kind of get the parents together and then kind of step away, or?
Yeah, so, well, we've been working with Citizens UK who kind of facilitate the meetings, and they're very much sort of for parents to run and co-chair those meetings, and they, you know, we might go in and have a chat with them, and they might ask us to do something, but it's really about what they are trying to do for their children in their community, and the school is really just the space in which they are coming together. But what it has done is really build trust and faith that we're all working in the same.
Also shows that you genuinely care.
Yeah.
And how do you transition the ideas that are spoken about in those meetings and putting those into a reality?
So the core concept is that it's for the parents to do that. So they will work together to decide what it is that they think is important. So one of the examples was that they didn't feel there was enough provision in the holidays for children with additional needs, and so they were working with local providers to see whether or not they could find something that would work for them and how that could work. And so they found a charity that was operating that sort of provision, but no one knew about it. So, you know, it's that kind of work. So I suppose there's that bit, but I think it does create an environment in which, if there are tensions, you know, people are unhappy about, I don't know, something's happening in nursery or in school, they have a forum that is trusting and positive that can raise some of those issues, and then we can respond as necessary.
And just for people listening, how did you start that relationship with Citizens UK? Is that something you just reach out and ask them to be involved in? Or?
Yeah, we just had it was just a program that we thought would be an interesting way of thinking about family engagement from a very different perspective and less, we do all the kind of, parenting classes and the, all of that stuff, but how can we really think about it from a relationship perspective, and how do you build those positive relationships, I suppose.
There's only so many hours in a day when someone's coming into work for actually delivering the learning, the support, the childcare to the children, and then also having the time outside of that to learn and develop themselves.
Yeah, it's really hard. And so we've just structured, I was talking earlier about structuring the staffing around the sort of peaks and troughs of when children are in, and we just try really hard, and it's an ongoing project to make sure that there's enough time in the week, in the month, in the term, in the year, where adults get time for themselves to do the work that they need to do. We also structure the sort of back office support in a very different way. So we've centralised all of that stuff, tried to take as much out of the nursery, so that the time that the nursery staff are working on adult things, they're working on adult things that are related directly to the outcomes for children. They're not doing finance and invoicing. They're not even doing, they're not doing kind of onboarding of new staff. That's all done outside. So trying to find time for the managers particularly to be in the room and to be coaching their team, rather than getting distracted by the sort of operational running of the setting, which I think is really important. I also think it's just about prioritization, right? Like, if you prioritize that, then that's what you do, and other things don't happen. We also close the nursery for an additional 5 days a year to parents. So we have these 5 days that we use across the year, so we can bring people together in different groups, managers or deputy managers, room leaders, so we can bring them together and train them as a cohort, which is also really nice. And that gives a bit more flexibility in the year.
And as you grow, obviously training in a cohort when you were in the 4 Ark schools, I guess, was probably easier. Now you're going out into maintained schools. What are some of the benefits and challenges of having some of your nurseries in Ark schools and some of them outside of the trust as a system?
I actually, it's hard working in schools, right? Like, schools have a very particular way of operating. They have their kind of systems. And I think you have to understand schools well to be able to work effectively in partnership with them. And I actually don't think it's any different within an Ark school or within another school. And within the maintained school, we're working in, exactly the same kind of issues, and versions of the issues arise. But I do think that, it's the way that we've set up Ark Start is that the important things for the individual school in terms of the relationship with families, the connectivity between the sort of reception class teacher and the nursery, lots of the stuff around SEND or around safeguarding, working really, really in close partnership, the transitions, all of that stuff. We work really, really, really hard with the school to make sure that works for the school community and for the way the school operates. At the same time, that sort of structural stuff around how we operate and how we train our team and all of that stuff is done very much in the same way across all of our settings. And so you try and make sure that it's bespoke to the community where that's helpful, and centralised where that's helpful, and getting that balance right, which I think comes back to the question about sustainability and how you make it as efficient as possible as well.
And when you are opening a new nursery, especially outside of an Ark school where you've already got some ties in the community, how do you establish yourself as a community-led nursery and really connect with the people who are living and then probably sending their children to your nurseries, and then that transition into a school that then isn't part of the trust?
Yeah, it's interesting. So obviously we've only done it once, although we're hoping to do it more. So I think what's really important in that context is that you've aligned on your mission and values with the individual school and with the leadership of that school, and working really closely with them to make sure that it feels like, something that is a net benefit to the school and also to the community. And that it's about how that is, how is that communicated in it initially, but also then how do you sort of, how do you live up to that promise? And I think the way that you do that is just by being really, really available and visible to the community, and people are upset about something or don't feel something's quite working, that you're really open and transparent about how you deal with that, and that there's really regular contact and relationships with the leadership of the host school. We work really, really hard to make sure that families feel, that they can raise anything at all. The beginning and the end of the day, we have very kind of strict protocols around in terms of the expectations of the team working with parents, but also kind of how communication can happen outside of that as well. If you want to talk to a manager or even a senior leader, then we'll make sure that you can do that. That kind of bringing parents into the nursery. We've got quite different models of how we work with families in the different settings, mainly because of how the local authority services work. But in our nursery in Croydon, we've got a very embryonic kind of family hub type thing sort of starting to develop. So the local authority runs a sort of range of services for families from the nursery. And that's really nice because it brings people in. In Wandsworth, we work with the local authority to deliver things like kind of parenting programs, that sort of thing. So there's sort of various different things that happen that bring the families in, and that really benefits the school as well, because they're obviously, if they have a really good experience in their first few years of working with a nursery, then obviously that can transition into the school. Exactly.
And one of the things that people are bringing up the pipeline that there's always front of mind is bums on seats.
Yeah.
Like getting those people through the door. Yeah. How much did that play into your willingness as a trust and like the idea of doing nurseries? Like how much was that to do with the pipeline and going through the trust? Obviously you now moved outside of the trust, so it's not a part of it totally now, but how much was that part of the thought
definitely
process?
So, part of the problem that we were facing was that some of our nurseries were really struggling to recruit children to meet the needs of the families, and that was having an impact on reception intake, or at least on how children were coming to school. So it's completely tied together for us. We're not sort of jealously guarding those children. So they can go to other schools. We obviously support children to go to the school that is best for their needs. And in working with a maintained school, our role is to make sure that children transition successfully into that school. That's the job. But I think it's a really important part of it. And I think it's really important because I think that the early years is a really important phase of a child's education. It makes sense for the school to have some connection and oversight of what that looks like and feels like, because it's really important that you get it right.
And how do you have the balance between, as Ark Start grows, keeping the nurseries as separate entities while still, I guess, pooling on the trust resources and, I guess, people and infrastructure?
So we're completely separate physically and staffing wise on site. So the nursery and the school operate independently of each other. They have lots of connections and partnerships, but it's completely sort of separate. Where we pull on resources is through kind of shared services at the central team and at that operational efficiency. And part of the way that's been built is to be able to grow quickly, because we hope that we will.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier is about how important early years education is in those ages from 0 to 5. Could you just speak to some of the things that happen in those early years of development to really explain how crucial those years are to a child's development?
Yeah. Well, I should, as I said at the beginning, I'm not an early years specialist, right? So I definitely can't speak about it as an early years specialist. But I think it's the evidence is completely clear, right? Over the first few years of a child's life, their brain is developing more quickly than at any other time in their life. If you miss certain developmental milestones when you're little, it is really, really hard to close that gap down the line. We know that 40% of the achievement gap that we see at age 16 has already visible by the time children reach school. And effectively, if you join school behind your developmental milestones, from there, the gap often just widens. We also know that the economic argument that, for £1 investment in early years, you can achieve what would cost £13 later. So there's a sort of multitude of arguments about why we should value more and invest more in our youngest children and in their families, right? And I think part of the reason that we haven't historically done that in quite that way is because it's so complex. You've got health, you've got family work, you've got education, you've got all these different elements. And so I think, we know the evidence is completely clear. We know that that's true. The question is, how do we make that happen within all our kind of, our complex settings with all the different partners that need to be involved, including, of course, parents.
And that balance between like pedagogy and then the childcare, you obviously said that it's not childcare first, Ark Start. Like you look at it the other way around. How hard was that to switch the mindset of some of the people who came in who already worked in other early year settings?
So what we would say is that, early education is care and care is early education, right? And that these two things are very entwined together, and that to try to separate them out is problematic, because when you're working with a young child, you're not educating them now and then caring for them over there. It's all part of the same thing, changing a nappy, toilet training, that's all education, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what we would say, and that's what we talk about a lot with our team. I think that the almost everyone who works in the early years would recognize that and agree with that. I think what's been harder is exactly that. How do you, if you've been working in a private nursery, so much of the kind of admin and compliance and the all of that stuff ends up being so much that your ability to then develop your pedagogy, your curriculum, all of the other thinking around it is just really limited. So, for us, it's about making sure that can continue to happen, and that we're really taking people on that journey of their own development so that they can be better educators and carers of the children in their care.
And when you're developing those like curriculums and ideals and ideas and values, is that all centrally led, or how much autonomy do you give to the individual nurseries in those settings to decide and kind of live those values?
Yeah. So our values are shared with Ark. So the 4 Ark Start values are the 4 Ark values. Our mission is the same as Ark's. And in that sense, it's very centralized, and we recruit and we train and we develop our teams according to those values. Of course, a nursery, like a school, is a place of human interaction, and therefore, the quality of the provision is in the quality of the interaction. The quality of the nursery is in the way that the team work together, and that isn't something that you can kind of direct on a day-to-day basis. It's something you have to build a culture and a community around, and that is, I think, where you see really exceptional. Where you see exceptional provision, but also where staff are happiest.
Yeah.
And so I think for us, it's more about, supporting, developing, training in line with our values and our mission, and with people sharing expertise. And there might be, amazing expertise here or there. And how do we make sure that people are constantly learning from each other? So I think the answer is probably that I hope our teams feel real autonomy in the way that they can make their nurseries as excellent as possible, but with a clarity of the expectations that exists within, and clear kind of protocols and operational structures that enable them to do that effectively.
And what do you think will be some of the biggest challenges that will arise as you try to scale? I guess you've experienced it in the trust firsthand. You saw that grow from nothing into all the schools you have now. Looking at that, and obviously there are differences in nursery and like the experiences you already had from going from 0 to 5. What do you think are some of those biggest challenges, and how would you foresee that you're going to overcome some of those?
So, the biggest challenge to our growth is finding sites to grow in, right? So that, I guess that's the sort of front of mind piece. And I hope that with the DFE just publishing its capital pot for primary schools to extend nursery provision, I hope that will facilitate us growing quickly, and other organisations like us. In terms of sort of practicalities, I think the biggest issue is the capacity of both our senior education leads. So at the moment there are 2. We will grow that as we grow bigger, but getting the right balance between their roles and the manager roles, I think is really hard as you grow, and what are the systems that you need in order to scale. The single biggest barrier to growth is the quality of aligned, excellent managers and room leaders, back to the workforce issue. So, how do we make sure that we've got people in post who have had enough experience, are aligned enough, who are ready to take on the management of these nurseries? And, you often get people saying, well, you just need more leadership. And it's like, well, you do need more leadership, but actually mainly what we need is people who are ready to do the work on the ground. And at the moment we're approaching that by having an apprenticeship kind of cohort coming up, and then also sort of running we're calling it a manager in training role. So we're hiring people who are aligned to our vision and values, but who want to learn how to be a manager, have aspirations for that in the future, and then supporting them in our settings to kind of learn the ropes and have the opportunity to, lead the setting while the manager's on leave or whatever, so that they are then ready to step into new sites as they open. So I think those are going to be the two, those are the two kind of big challenges, I think.
I think post-COVID with the workforce as well, like competing with the private sector when it comes to like flexible working, do you have any, obviously you spoke about the peaks and troughs in the week and balancing the workforce around that. Do you have any ideas of how you're going to approach that sort of conversation with people when you're trying to bring them into the sector?
Yeah, so we have a pretty flexible approach to our teams. So we have a shorter than average working week for staff in general. So it's 37 and a half hours a week, rather than lots of nurseries. Staff will be working sort of 40, 45 hours a week as standard. So partly we've just done that.
Yeah.
And then within that, we have lots and lots of people. Some of them are working term time only. Yeah. Some of them are working, 2 or 3 days a week. We have we've tried to be really, really flexible to support people who need to go and, collect their children from school, or, all of those things. And we basically spend a huge amount of time trying to do the jigsaw puzzle that is, how does all this connect together? But I think it is, it's completely clear that in the current situation, you can't tell people you want them to do these hours in this way. You have to be flexible, and actually getting the best people who are really brilliant with children, who really want to learn and develop, who are really reflective on their practice, who are ambitious and aspirational for the families that we work in, is much more important than if they want to work 5 days a week or 3 days a week. So we have certain requirements of our teams in terms of like exactly, we can't facilitate every arrangement, but being really clear about which arrangements we can facilitate, and then how we can make that work for you is part of, I think, the culture that we need to build.
And if a trust leader is listening to this now and thinking, potentially this is something we might be thinking about doing as a trust, launching like a nurseries model, what would be your, say, top 3 pieces of advice from the lessons you've learned to getting that off the ground in a way that suits the trust and also as a separate entity as well?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I'd say is it's really hard. And I think if you were to do it, you would want to make sure that you were able to do it at a scale that meant that the nursery entity could operate independently, sort of financially, but also kind of have enough going on that you are able to build development into individuals' experience, that you are able to cover between settings, that you are able to learn from each other. So I think I would say think about scale. And if you don't think you have the scale, think about partnering in that way. I think I would say that, running a school nursery class is very different from running a nursery and all the flexibility and the kind of operational challenges that come with that. And it isn't that easy to make a nursery operate within a school structure and systems. The expectations of families and the expectations of the flexibility around it are different. Not everywhere, but they often are different. So it is about sort of thinking more clearly, I suppose, about what is it that needs to be the same and what is it that needs to be different. And I think that's why it's hard it's not straightforward for schools, running a nursery class I mean, I think hard, and lots of people find it hard, but it's still, is broadly the same as reception. You can have your early years phase lead, that works. And we have within the Ark network very, very successful large nurseries that operate in that way from 2 all the way through. But once you start getting into the more flexible, affordable, all year round provision, once you get into the under 2s, once you get into that space, it's a different ball game. And I think it needs to be treated that way. And I think that goes back to the question you asked earlier. So we only answered the workforce side of the question about what the government should do. I think it's great to be asking the school system to be thinking more about early years. I think it's really important. I think that the idea that we're going to be able to find the capacity and the ability to run that sort of nursery for 9 months all the way through to 5 flexibly, just standalone primary schools doing that. I'm sure there are primary schools that will be able to do that with absolutely brilliantly. But I'm not sure that's a scalable solution. It feels a little bit, it just doesn't.
Sticking plaster a bit.
A little bit. And so I suppose I would say that whole structure of, well, how do we really think about, how does the government think about the structure of nursery provision across the country, and what do we want it to look like? What do we think is important about it? How do we regulate it? How do we commission it? How do we try and move? And, from my perspective, how do we try and move away from a kind of very fractured, market-driven but highly regulated system to a system that's a bit more part of the structure of our society and the public services that we have for our families. And I think that shift is very complex, but I do think that it's a burning platform. I think we need to do it. And I think until we do that, we won't be able to solve the workforce problems. We won't be able to really drive outcomes for our youngest children. And I think we're letting down, some of our most vulnerable families.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess leading on from that question, if all of that changes, you're going to be leading the change in your communities, in your areas, regardless of what the government do with Ark Start. And what would you like and hope for the next 5 years for Ark Start? What would you like to see? What's the vision and the goals that you have in mind?
So I guess we have to, primarily we now need to get our network to a size where it can operate sustainably. And when I say sustainably, I mean financially sustainably, but also sustainably in terms of the workforce and our ability to drive excellence through our workforce. So I guess that's the kind of, on an operational level, that's the aim. I think what I really hope we can do is be a real proof of concept that actually, if you put in the right inputs and energy and resources, with the right leadership and the right team doing the right stuff, actually you can really accelerate children's outcomes, and that our schools will experience that as children go through reception and into year 1. And it'll be, that these children will have the really, really strong foundations that enable them to thrive at school. And I suppose as part of that, we hope that all of our families feel really, really happy and confident that their children are getting the best provision they can, and that's enabling them to go and, whether it's going back into the workplace or studying or simply, feeling like they know better how to support their children to succeed at school, that they feel really happy and confident in their children and in our ability to help their children.
On the podcast, we like to finish with 4 quickfire questions.
Okay.
So question number 1, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the education sector at this very moment?
Workforce. And I think that's, we've talked a lot about workforce in the early years sector. We know that there's a recruitment crisis across the teacher workforce. Our teachers and our educators are the most important people that our children interact with outside of their parents and their families. We need to invest in those people. We need to drive teaching as a really high value career. We need to recognise it. It's our future.
Second question, what motivates you on difficult days?
I think I was saying earlier that I'm an optimist. So I have a deep belief in the importance of social change and social transformation. I believe deeply in the transformational possibility of education. And I have a deep optimism that we can improve our country as a whole, our society as a whole, and specifically, I suppose, a deep optimism that we can affect change for children and for their families. So.
Question number 3, what has been your biggest achievement in your career so far?
Oh God, I don't have one. I don't know. I am really proud to be part of to have been part of a system where I think the head teachers that I've worked with, the leaders that I now work with at Ark Start, I think are some of the most unbelievably impressive people, and I just feel incredibly privileged to have worked with them.
And the final question, what are you most looking forward to this academic year?
I am looking forward to getting Ark Start just to that next stage of its growth, so that we can really start to think and feel and work through some of the knotty issues around how we scale. And I'm really excited at the end of next year, this academic year, to see all of our new staff and how they've kind of bedded into the system and feel part of the overall team.
Wow, I'm really looking forward to seeing all the progress of Ark Start. I feel like you've done so much already in a short amount of time, so it'll be exciting to see where it goes in the future. Thank you so much for coming on today, Katie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening, and thank you very much to Katie for joining us today. To find out more about how The Key can support your trust, please visit thekeysupport.com/trust. For more information about Katie, links to relevant resources, and information on how to subscribe to the Trust Matters monthly newsletter, head to the description below. If you enjoyed the episode, please do like and subscribe or leave us a review.